Hi, everybody, and welcome to Every Movie Ever. I am, of course, your host, Eric, and this is the show where we are trying to review every movie ever made. And this week, I'd like to start the show off by talking to you about True Romance. Now, this is an early film from Quentin Tarantino. While I don't know if controversial is the word, but sometimes, certainly not to everyone's taste, I suppose is the way to put it. It's certainly one of my favorite directors working today. I had never seen True Romance. Like I say, it's from early in his career, but this is kind of the odd man out in the Tarantino filmography in that this one is only scripted by Tarantino. He did not direct it. Instead, this was directed by Tony Scott. He's the director, or the brother rather, of fellow director Ridley Scott, and is a very fine filmmaker in his own right. I was very excited to finally sit down and watch it, and I gotta tell you, I, for the most part, didn't like it, which is not my favorite, because of Tarantino's 8 released films that he directed, I like all of them, and I've only been liking them more and more. I think his last 3, Inglourious Basterds, Django Unchained, and The Hateful Eight, are his 3 best. I'm looking forward to his new film, Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, which will be about Hollywood in the 70s and sort of touching on the Manson family. This film, however, is, I can't say that it isn't scripted by Tarantino. Like, it doesn't feel like the script was really messed with, and while the direction isn't what I would expect from him, it's certainly capable direction. The problem here is unlikable characters. The storyline follows a video store clerk played by Christian Slater, who falls in love with a lady of the evening, and the two of them getting involved in in stealing some drugs from a drug dealer and trying to sell it so that they can start a new life. The result, honestly, is a misogynist fairy tale. It is, very much male power fantasy embodied in Christian Slater's character, and this idea of the female lead, played by Patricia Arquette, being someone who needs to be rescued by him, but not just a standard damsel in distress, adding that layer onto it of that she is the, to use the parlance, the hooker with the heart of gold that he needs to rescue and who has fallen in love with him. There's also a lot of other troubling things about her character and about the way the plot plays out. Like I say, I didn't like it. Now, that said, there is still some snappy dialogue in it. There are still some memorable moments. It is not a complete waste of time. It is just not for me, which is why I'm giving it 2.5 stars. All right, our next movie today, this one comes at the request of our review graphics editor, Gavin Van Treese. Gavin wanted me to watch The Prince of Egypt, and I did. Why? Because it was on Netflix. Which, point of order, if you guys would like me to watch a movie, send me an email, leave me a comment. As long as it's on some sort of streaming site where I can see it if I have a subscription, I'll watch it. Prince of Egypt, this is the animated retelling of the 10 Commandments and Moses story from the, late 1990s. Certainly, I'm a fan of the 10 Commandments, the Charlton Heston on TV every Easter picture, and this is kind of telling that same story with an animated musical twist. It's an early picture from DreamWorks Animation. The animation is pretty good. I like the style of the characters who are rendered very stylistically as opposed to just sort of photoreal. It's an okay retelling of the story, but it's not one that is ever going to replace the 10 Commandments for me or become my de facto version of the story, I'm sorry to say. It is just okay. Again, the style's nice. There's a lot of songs in it that I have to be honest, I found all very forgettable. There's one song at the beginning about, I think it's called Deliver Us, that's pretty good, but even that's slipping from the mind. I was also a little troubled. They did a thing that you could get away with in the 90s that I don't think you could get away with today, which is that this story of the Jews in slavery in Egypt, so all your characters are Middle Eastern Jews and Egyptians, are all played by white actors. And as far as I could tell, only Jeff Goldblum is Jewish in the cast. Otherwise, you have, of all people, Val Kilmer playing Moses. Now, granted, that is not so far divorced from Charlton Heston playing Moses, right? But it is a thing that sort of stood out on this viewing for me. It's an okay movie. I don't really have a lot to say about it. I'm going to give it 3 stars. Along those same veins, sort of speaking of 90s animated musicals that I've missed out on all this time, finally saw Anastasia. Now, this is the story of Anastasia, a woman. So it's about the Russian Revolution and the death of the Tsar and his family, the Romanovs. But the idea that maybe one of them, the Princess Anastasia, survived, which is a real historical thing. That there was this woman in the 1950s or 40s, I guess, going around Europe claiming to be Anastasia. Now, in real life, it turned out that she was not Anastasia, and there is now historical and forensic evidence that shows that, I'm sorry to say, Anastasia did die alongside her family. Yeah, listen, this movie takes the, sort of the fantasy, I don't want to say Disney princess, but that kind of idea, that turn of the story. Saying, no, this is Anastasia, and she has, sort of fallen into poverty and forgotten who she is, and she meets a guy, what do I want to call him, a con artist, who is himself trying to find somebody to pass off as Anastasia, but of course, in the way that these movies work, he has found the actual Anastasia. Anastasia here is played by Meg Ryan. John Cusack plays the con artist. And all of Anastasia's stuff is actually pretty fun. I enjoyed it for the most part. There's some really touching moments in there, particularly when she meets her surviving relative, played by Murder, She Wrote. But the rest of the movie, so you've got this great, sort of princess story and this rags to riches story, right? But it's paired for some reason with a story about Rasputin, which... Now, Rasputin's another historical figure, and he was an ascetic, a monk, who met and sort of, I guess you could say, seduced the Romanov family toward the end of their reign. He hung around the palace a lot. He claimed to have healing powers. He was himself largely a con artist. He was rumored to be involved in the dark arts. And it's arguable that his advice led to the fall of the Romanov family, as he gave the Tsar a lot of really crummy advice that the Tsar followed that made the people dislike the Tsar. Now, that's a simplistic way of stating it. There's certainly a lot of other socioeconomic reasons for the Russian Revolution, but you can't say that Rasputin didn't have a part in it. Now, here he's played as a kooky, crazy, undead sorcerer, played by Christopher Lloyd, who uses his magic to create the revolt. And for some reason wants all of the Romanovs dead, and now that he finds out that Anastasia's still alive, wants her dead too. Now, he and Anastasia never really cross paths until the very end of the movie. She doesn't even know that he's out there. Which makes all of his stuff feel very tacked on. Like, you had this very nice movie, this very kind of standard, romantic comedy, rags to riches story of Anastasia, and then somebody at the studio went, hey, this thing needs a magic bad guy. And so then they added all that stuff in, and it all leads to this weird battle at the end where he's using magic to animate statues that she has to give away from. I didn't care for all of that. So, the Anastasia stuff, pretty good. The Rasputin stuff, pretty bad. That adds up to a movie that's right down the middle, 3 stars. All right, friends, it is time to call all horror hounds. This week's horror movie is Warlock. This is an 80s horror movie about, you guessed it, a warlock, which is a male witch. In this case, the male witch is played by Julian Sands, who does a terrific job as this, sort of smarter than you thinking man's evil killer warlock. The story, such as it is, revolves around a warlock from the 17th or 16th century, uses magic to come forward to our time and wreak havoc. He is pursued by a witch hunter played impeccably by Richard E. Grant, who along with Sands brings a real sense of panache to what is otherwise sort of a mundane horror script. The female lead's a lady named Laurie Singer. She's a modern lady who teams up with Richard E. Grant. One of the things that I liked about this movie, and I did like about this movie, is that the Warlock early on places a curse on Laurie Singer's character so that every day she ages 10 years. So as the movie progresses, she gets older and older, and the makeup, while not phenomenal, is fairly convincing by 80s horror movie standards. There's some good scares, there's some good kills. I sort of like the mythology and sort of the rules they set up for combating warlocks and witches. The special effects are all right. It is not a hit it out of the ballpark movie, but it was one that I enjoyed quite a bit, and the rare slice of 80s horror that I had never gotten around to seeing. I do think it's worth your time, if not up to the level of, the pantheon of horror. But still a pretty solid horror movie, 3.5 stars. All right, folks, I think it's about time we checked out a Hollywood classic. This week's Hollywood classic is Once Upon a Honeymoon. If you've been watching this show, you know that I have recently come around to the comedic films of the great Ginger Rogers and recognizing her as a somewhat unsung film comedian. And so I was excited to check out this movie, which has a bunch of my favorite things in it. So not only do you have Ginger Rogers, you have the great Cary Grant, and you've got Nazis, as Ginger and Cary play a couple of people trying to get out of Nazi-occupied Europe. Ginger is an American lounge singer who has gone to Germany and is sort of gold digger marrying a guy who ends up being a high-ranking Nazi official. Cary Grant is an American journalist who is trying to get Ginger to start sort of do the right thing. Now, especially from that title and the way the movie sort of looks when you look it up, it seems like this is going to be a zany comedy. The truth is this movie was not what I expected and takes some hard turns to serious business involving subplots about like the concentration camps and Ginger Rogers giving her passport to her Jewish maid to help her and her daughter escape from Nazi-occupied France, I think. There's a lot of spy work going on in this. This is not, I guess I was expecting To Be or Not to Be, which the great Jack Benny movie, which is a farce that does deal with Nazi Germany in emotional and affecting ways, but is still at its heart, a satire and a farce and filled with broad and laughable characters. I'm thinking particularly of the German officer that Jack Benny has to con near the end of the movie with his whole concentration camp Earhart speech. That's the kind of guy I was expecting from Ginger's husband in this. Instead, we get a guy who's much closer to like Claude Rains's Nazi roles. He is he's a smart guy, he's a shrewd guy, and an evil guy. So yeah, this is not the light comedy that I was expecting. It's a movie that sort of oscillates greatly tonally because there are some broad comedic moments in it, but they're really juxtaposed against some very serious business. It's also a pretty long movie. It's still a good movie, just, maybe not as good as it could have been, and a movie that could have used, I think, a little more, maybe one more run at the script and a little more editing. Still, I'm going to give it 3 stars. All right, let's open up the Columbo files. Today, I want to talk, we're looking at a 90s episode of Columbo. And the 90s episodes, as we have discussed many times, not as good as the 70s Columbos, but still some diamonds in the rough out there. Today, we're talking about It's All in the Game, which certainly has a stellar cast, as Peter Falk is joined in this one by the great Faye Dunaway as the murderer, as well as her accomplice, Claudia Christian, who I'm a fan of from her days on Babylon 5. Faye Dunaway has murdered a guy. It turns out that Claudia Christian is Faye Dunaway's daughter, and they've put together this plot to kill a guy that was sort of playing them against each other, that they were both dating. But the murder sort of takes a back seat in this Columbo, as much of the plot revolves around Faye Dunaway thinking she's getting away with things by sort of trying to by trying to seduce Columbo. It's not, so much a young, sexy seduction. This is more of like an old people, let's have lunch kind of a seduction. But it's a little weird, and what I didn't like about it is Columbo is a married man. In the series, he makes a lot of references to his wife, who I believe not only has shown up a couple of times, but also had her own sort of aborted spinoff. In any event, this particular movie sort of blurs the line of whether Columbo is interested in Faye Dunaway in return. It's certainly in Columbo's character to sort of play along and wait for Faye Dunaway to make her mistake, which is certainly what happens, but it is difficult to tell in this one if Columbo is just playing around or if he kind of likes it. So not my favorite Columbo, but still pretty okay. 2.5 stars. All right, let's head over to MST3 A to Z. This is, of course, the part of the show where we are looking at every Mystery Science Theater movie in alphabetical order. And today I want to talk to you about Boggy Creek 2, The Legend Continues. This is a Bigfoot movie and part of, yes, the Boggy Creek series. And believe it or not, Boggy Creek 2 is actually part 3. It is the third Boggy Creek movie, if you can wrap your head around that. Because you've got the original The Legend of Boggy Creek, which is a sort of proto-Blair Witch pseudo-documentary where they purporting to do a documentary about Bigfoot sightings, but it's largely built around reenactments and staged testimonies and things like that. It is not a great movie, but it's a watchable and interesting enough movie in sort of the history of that kind of thing. After that, you've got The Return to Boggy Creek, which my brother and I tackled on our show, Bad Movie Brothers, and you might want to track down that episode to find out our thoughts about that sort of amiable family movie, which is more narrative-based. It's about a couple of kids befriending that Bigfoot. Now, Boggy Creek 2 sort of combines elements from the original Boggy Creek and its sequel, in that this one combines a narrative about a professor and his students going out to find the movie with that faux documentary style where actors pretending to be people relay interview style their experiences that we then see dramatized as these Bigfoot encounters. It is not particularly good. It's a little bit ineptly made, as kind of all three of the Boggy Creek movies are. This one's also not terribly interesting and falls into some very silly shenanigans involving a woodsman, I guess you'd call him, who has kidnapped a baby Bigfoot at the end. It's okay. It's more watchable than some of these, but it's still only 1.5 stars. Okay, guys, it is time for no one's favorite part of the show. This is the worst of the week. This week we're talking about Evolution. Now, this is a movie that I saw when it came out in theaters. I remember I went to see it with my mom. And we saw that this was going to be an Ivan Reitman movie that looked a little bit like Ghostbusters, so we thought, oh, well, this ought to be like Ghostbusters. I then promptly forgot everything about it except thinking it wasn't particularly good. I decided to rewatch it here recently, and yeah, it's forgettable, but it also is really bad. And it very much is just Reitman doing Ghostbusters again. This movie follows the storyline of Ghostbusters beat by beat, as David Duchovny of the X-Files fame and Orlando Bloom play a couple of professors who stumble across a meteorite that has landed with alien cells that quickly evolve into alien monsters that they have to fight. It is pretty bad. Sean William Scott is also along for the ride as a firefighter trainee who gets roped in, and this, the movie builds in very much the same way to them fighting a giant alien at the end. It is all pretty forgettable. None of it is very good. The brief bright spot, and it's very brief, is Julianne Moore in one of her earlier film appearances, playing a government scientist who starts off opposed to our heroes, but joins them by the end. What I liked about Julianne Moore's performance here is that she decided to play her character as being clumsy, so she's always like falling over and knocking things off, and so it's fun to see her do that sort of physical comedy. But this is a very small sliver of sunshine in this otherwise complete misfire of a movie that I can only in good conscience give 1.5 stars. All right, friends, the only way we can wash the taste of the worst of the week out of our mouths is with the best of the bunch. Best of the bunch this week has got to go to Blade Runner 2049. Now, this was a movie that even going into it, I was conflicted about. Partially because I have a conflicted relationship with the original Blade Runner. There is no denying that Blade Runner, the Ridley Scott classic that stars Harrison Ford as a policeman who chases down rogue robots, is a classic of the genre and one of the most influential movies of the last, 30 years, at least from the point of view of production design. Everything today still wants to look like Blade Runner, and Blade Runner still looks great. So when they announced this long-haul sequel to Blade Runner, which, let's be honest, has a really dopey title, I was pretty skeptical. You know, that first Blade Runner, like I say, it's extremely influential, but it's a movie that, as time goes on, I've been souring on a little bit. It's a little bit boring. The characters, particularly Harrison Ford, I'm not sure are all that engaging. The replicants, which is what they call the robots, are all terrific and great, and that production design is great. But it's also a movie that's more than a little pretentious, and is a movie that sometimes feels like homework. So Blade Runner 2049, now the big way to get me interested in this movie was with its director. For whatever reason, Ridley didn't want to come back for this one, even though he's been slumming it doing Alien sequels the last couple of years. But for this one, they got Denis Villeneuve. I don't know how to say it. I should learn because I am apparently a professional film critic. But in any event, Denis Villeneuve comes in to direct this thing, and I have been loving his movies. I was maybe not that into Sicario. I need to rewatch it because I feel like I should like it more than I did. But I loved Prisoners. I really loved Arrival. So I'm gonna, and I mean, those aren't just like, oh, that was a good movie. Those are some great movies. Those are some real out-of-the-park ones. So whatever his new movie is going to be, I want to see it. And in this case, it's Blade Runner. This movie is gorgeous. It is, I mean, there's no escaping that it's influenced by the original, obviously. And I don't know if I can say that it really does anything new or challenging with that aesthetic. But it still looks great. It's also pretty interesting. This one revolves around, so the first movie plays with this idea of maybe Harrison Ford's character is a robot. Maybe he's a robot that thinks he's a human hunting robots. This movie is very upfront. Our new hero, our new policeman, Ryan Gosling, is a robot hunting robots. And he seems to be having a sort of emotional awakening over the course of the movie as he stumbles onto a plot about figuring out, is he, about finding Harrison Ford. Where, who is he and what happened to him? Because it looks as though Harrison Ford and his robot girlfriend might have had a baby. And if robots can be having babies, that's a big sea change in the world. Incidentally, it looks for much of the movie, and spoiler alerts abound, that Ryan Gosling might be that baby. Now, the most interesting thing this movie does, and maybe my favorite part of it, is they make the decision that Ryan Gosling is not that baby. Just that Ryan Gosling shares some of the memories in his core programming of that baby for reasons that will make sense if you watch the movie. But the point is, he ain't the baby. He is not special, which is a narrative turn I really enjoy, because the whole idea that he is the baby finding his dad is a little trite and cliche. So I was very happy they didn't go that way. It's an interesting movie. It's an exciting movie. There's some good performance in it. And like I say, it is absolutely gorgeous to look at. Now, my main criticism of the movie is, much like the original Blade Runner, is that it does not treat its female characters very well. In particular, Ryan Gosling's girlfriend, who I believe is named Joy, who is a hologram, which is a pretty interesting idea, that you have this hologram dating this robot, and she has no substance because she's a hologram, but she would like it, and she's maybe more emotionally evolved than he is. It's an interesting dynamic, but it mostly gets played as that she is a thing, and then that she doesn't get treated very well. And there's not really an alternative to be had. There is a lady robot assassin, but she's never really fleshed out. Robin Wright plays Ryan Gosling's police officer superior, but her character never really gets panned out. It is a movie wherein women are largely treated as things for the service of the male characters, and I don't care for that. Still, it was a movie that I enjoyed, certainly much more than I thought I would. I wish that it had a more evolved sensibility in that regard. I wish that it had embraced modern times maybe a little bit more, but it did still manage to tell a really good-looking and somewhat interesting story. I'm going to give it a pretty high rating today that I feel like might come down in subsequent viewings, but for right now, for today, I have to give Blade Runner 2049 4 stars. So that's going to do it for this episode of Every Movie Ever. Thank you so much for watching. We'll be back next time as we keep trying to review every movie ever made. Good night.